And I was going to talk about some things in Nehemiah, which is way back in the Old Testament, which was a story of the children of Israel. They actually got into some bad stuff and they got carried away as captives to Babylon and Persia. And they were down there for 70 years as captives to these nations around them. And then one day God spoke to the king of that place. His name was Cyrus. And for some reason Cyrus responded and he said, I would like to go down to Jerusalem and build a temple to God. He wasn't even an Israeli, and God got through to him somehow that these people that were held in captivity in his nation, that he should go down and do something for them. So he went down there and started building a temple. And there was a lot of opposition, and quite a lot of years went by, and then God spoke to Nehemiah, who was one of these people that were in captive in this Babylon, Persia area. And he felt that God had told him to go and repair Jerusalem.
Yes.
Now, if you just imagine a derelict city after 70 years of nobody in it, no habitation, and lots of sort of enemies around the whole place. After 70 years it became derelict. The walls got pulled down, and they were stone walls, and all the gates were burnt with fire.
Yes.
So he went down to Jerusalem to do it, and he was just kind of shocked how terrible it was and how much work it was going to take to bring the city back to the way it was. And in Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, which is, I don't know where it is in your Bible, but it's page something mine. Nehemiah decides to do something about it. So in the chapter 2, tells us that the king had wine before him, so he must have been quite happy at that stage, okay? And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad before in his presence. So this is the king, and this is Nehemiah in front of the king. And the king says to him, and he says that he'd never been sad before in the presence of the king. But the king said to me, "Why do you look sad?" So, hey, it must have looked quite miserable, eh? Since you are not sick. Hey, the king could decide the difference between a sick person and a sad person.
Yeah.
And he was saying, how, if you're not sick, are you so sad? So, this is nothing but sorrow of heart. You look, then I was very much afraid. I don't know why I was afraid, probably because his expression could show how sad he was. And said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should I not be sad, faced with when the city, the place of my fathers, lies waste, and its gates are consumed by fire?" The king said to me, "What do you ask?" And I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to him, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favour in your sight, I ask you that you will send me to Judah, to the city of my fathers, that I may rebuild it." And the king, beside whom the queen was sitting, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you return?" So it pleased him to send me, and I set him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors beyond the Euphrates River, that you may let me pass through to Judah." And he gave him a letter. You know, I love the Bible in a way that it tells me God's redemption through Jesus Christ, but from another aspect of the Bible, it's an amazing history book. History is documented so clearly. And he went down to there, and everybody rose up against him when he went there. There were people that just didn't want him to rebuild the city. Enemies. And so I came to Jerusalem and had been there 3 days. And I rose in the night, and I took a few men with me, and I told them what my God had put in my heart. I went out by night into the valley gate towards the Dragon's Well, to the dung gate and inspected the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed with fire. And this was a mammoth task.
Yeah.
And it made me think of our lives.
Yeah.
Do we sometimes see that our life is a mammoth task ahead of us?
Yeah.
You know, I think we all got mammoth tasks sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes a small thing can be a mammoth task. And sometimes the mammoth task is real. This is a big thing. But he took up the challenge to repair that town. And he had people on the wall, with that, it says, with the tools of repairing in one hand and a sword in the other, because the opposition to building, like it looked like, looking at it through ordinary eyes, it looked like an impossibility. How can we put this together? Because most of the people are still back in captivity.
Yeah.
But he organised families to be behind the wall and keep an eye out with a sword that nobody would come through, and eventually that was done. I think it's an amazing good news story of the impossibility becoming possible. You know how some things look impossible in life, and we just say, what can be done about that? How can I fix it? What pathway? But you know, I know that, I think the angel that came to Mary and told her she was going to get pregnant by the Holy Spirit said with all things are possible. And I think he might have said nothing is impossible with God, right? So if the task ahead of you and I is so big that we can't understand how we can get through it and how we can put it all together, just remember, with God nothing is impossible. You know, I've seen things in my life that were impossible, and yet 20 years later the possibility has come through. And you know, if your vision of what you want to have done, what you are going to try and achieve, looks utterly impossible, it's possible. You know, I went to a meeting on Wednesday night in Gore, and there was not a whole lot of farmers that were disturbed about what the government is putting upon them. And the thing looked impossible, the things that needed changing. And yet, you know what? I have faith it's possible through God. So, take heart. The possibility is the good news that Celia was talking about this morning. The possibility is there. You just take stock of your life and think at the moment, what would you see as impossible that could be possible with God? Just have a think about that. Just take a moment, you know? Does it look too big for you? God says nothing's impossible.
I said yes.
You said yes, but you know that He can do it. It's what's called faith, actually. Faith. I just want to read a nice little story to you from John's Gospel. Fortunately, I can't find the place. It's in John's Gospel, chapter 6. And I think this is an encouraging chapter when the impossible becomes possible. Okay, we want to read it. So, after this, Jesus went to the farthest side of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd was following him because they had seen the signs and miracles which he did, and healing those who were sick. And Jesus walked up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was approaching. And Jesus looked up then, and seeing a vast multitude was coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread, so that all these may be able to eat?" But he said this to prove and test them, for he was well aware what he was about to do. Philip answered him and said, 200 pennies worth of bread is not enough that everyone may receive even a little. So, I mean, they were running on limited finances, I would say. Obviously, it almost sounds like there was 200 pennies worth in the kitty. And he looked at these which I think ran into thousands of people, and just decided, well, we can't do it. You haven't got enough money. And then another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a little boy here who has with him 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many people?" Hey, he thought there was a little bit of something about this, a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish. But he said, well, that's no consequence to thousands of people. But I thought the thing in here is that he did say it, like he had a slight feeling that we've got a little bit. What could we do to make this work? And Jesus said, "Make all the people recline, sit down." The ground was covered with thick grass at that spot. So the men threw themselves down, about 5,000 in number. I would think there were probably some women there and children. So Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to the people. So also he did with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they had all had enough, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that are left over, so nothing be lost and wasted." So accordingly they went and gathered them up, and they filled 12 small baskets with fragments left over by those who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. And when the people saw the sign, that miracle that Jesus had performed, they began saying, "Surely and beyond a doubt, this is the prophet who is to come into the world." And Jesus, knowing that they meant to come and make him a king, they come and seize him, that they may make him a king, withdrew again to the hillside by himself alone. And if you think of that, the impossibility of it, it was crazily impossible, absolutely crazily impossible. It's like having that little bit of bread we have there for communion, and having 5,000 people stretched down here, wondering how to do it. So I just want to encourage you today that your impossibility is not beyond being redeemed by God. The impossibility that you have, the impossibility. I once read a book called Viva Cristo Rey, and that's Spanish. That means blessing to the Lord Jesus Christ. And it was actually written in Mexico. And the Catholic Church on the American side of the Mexican border decided to help their poor brothers in Mexico. So they put on a feast one Christmas or something. And they thought it was going to be for about 40 people. But literally hundreds of poor Mexican Christians, Catholic Christians, came to this feast, hundreds. And they knew they had trouble. They started blessing the bread. And they said, as they kept cutting the ham, it never ever stopped. The ham was always there. They cut this ham and they fed all those people. It was an absolute miracle. because they used the little bit they have. What little bit have you got to give? Just, have you got a little bit of faith? Just a little tiny bit for your life for the future. And so because of that, these the Catholic Church in Mexico, people were living on a rubbish dump on the Mexican side of the border. God started blessing these people. And the end of this story is that everybody that was living on that rubbish dump got themselves a house to live in, because God's blessing was so amazing in this area. Just because, I think, because those Catholic priests stepped out in faith to feed somebody in spite of not having resources. So I just want to encourage you here this morning with this. I can't encourage you with anything else. Be encouraged that which looks impossible can come to pass. But we can actually just trust Jesus to take hold of that thing. Like he took hold of the bread and he blessed it. And the miracle of the multiplication happened. We can just give some of this stuff to Jesus and say, well, it's bigger than I can handle. It's bigger than I can observe, think, or do anything with. Take it. And with your blessing, I'm sure for something to happen, you know. Yeah, I just feel that's about it today.
Very good, actually.
If you want to talk to me about it afterwards, that's fine. But I think my life is a miracle. Ollie's just read my book, haven't you, Ollie? And there were things happened in that book that were beyond my control. God took control of some things. And that book is a story of, I don't know if you remember, of a man that I was in a mental hospital in England, and Celia was visiting. I wasn't a patient, by the way. And Celia's cousin was in there. She'd escaped from another asylum and gone there to see her mother, and the mother had put her in this one just down the road. And Celia went to see her cousin, which she hadn't seen for 30 years. But her cousin didn't like me. I mean, I was right in the way. She knew Celia as a single woman, not as married, and she didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I said, look, I'll just go and I will go somewhere else. So I went into this common room. There was nobody else in except one man. He was sitting at a table with a biro pen in his hand, and he had it over top of it. Do you remember the blue aerograms? If anybody old enough here to remember aerograms, back in the good old days. And he had the pen hovering over this, and he just looked up and he said, just writing to my old girlfriend, you know. I haven't seen her for 25 years. And so he tells me this story that he was a sailor sailing around the world with his own. And he met this lady called Beverly in New Zealand, of all places. I'm in England, by the way. And Beverly, and just writing to her, I said, have you got his address? Oh, no. He said, no, he said, I haven't trained him for 20. I don't know where she is, but I'm going to write that. So, I mean, this was all going on. So, silly me said, oh, well, I'm from New Zealand. Oh, he said, will you find Beverly for me? And I looked at him and thought, well, I stammered. I got round the question somehow, and not long after that, he said, she's Beverly Jackson. She came from Northland. You might know what I'm talking about.
I'll ask my mum.
And that was all I knew. Beverly Jackson from Northland. And she was a nurse, he said. We had so much fun in New Zealand when my ship called in. So, Celia come about that stage. I walk away, and of course I get back to New Zealand a couple of months later, and I suddenly remember Beverly, and I thought, oh no, that's nothing there in that. And one day I was walking down D Street, and I walked past the post office, and those days they had all telephone books in the post office, like a whole of everyone in the country. And I'm walking past, and I just sort of, oh, there's the telephone book. Oh, I'm going to have a look at the Northland book. So I go to the Northland book, and there's about 70 Jacksons. There's about 30 or 40 in Whangarei, and all the rest are all over the districts. And I had a feeling I should go into districts, not Whangarei. So I remember this is, I don't know whether this is spiritual or God or what, but I looked at them and I said, well, I shut my eyes and said, God, just let me put my finger on the right one. So I shut my eyes, pushed my finger on, and I looked at the Jackson I got. The Jackson was blah blah, and there's the phone number. So I got my pen out, wrote this number down, and I forgot about it. In the meantime, Rodney writes to me from England, says, have you found Beverly yet? And I thought, oh, that's okay. So if you think back, you know, we don't realise how things around us have progressed over the years. Because you remember, say, 30 years ago, you almost had to make a deliberate effort to make a phone call outside your district. I don't even know whether we had prefixes. Did we go through? Did we actually go to someone in exchange? I don't know. Anyway, calling from here to anywhere in the North Island was very expensive, actually. And to talk to England was horrendously expensive. In fact, I can remember when I went to England, I actually had to make an arrangement with a telephone exchange to make a call, you know. Anyway, so I looked at it and thought, and miserable me thought, you know, it costs a lot of money to do that. So one day, it was 3 months later, so now 6 months have gone by. I've carried this thing around in my pocket for about 3 months. This was remarkable. It shows you how far we've progressed. That Telecom had a free calling all over New Zealand for a weekend.
Yeah.
They did this weekend. So, I've got the number in my... So I pulled the number out and dialed up.
Yeah.
And
It was.
I said, is that Jackson's? Yeah, Jackson. I said, you don't know me. I don't know what to say to the guy. I said, I'm looking for a Beverly Jackson. And this is how this conversation went. He said, yes. I said, but I'm looking for a Beverly Jackson. That was a nurse. And he said, yes. And I thought, I said to him then, do you know her? And he said, yes, she's my sister. So she's my sister. I said, I'm really stuck there because I don't know what to say to the
Strange man.
because I've just been an award for people that are mentally unstable. And I met a guy there that is looking for his old girlfriend who was Beverly Jackson in Northland. So I said, I met an old boyfriend of hers that was in a hospital, didn't say what sort, and he was a bit depressed, I said, and he was just looking for this lady Beverly Jackson. And the guy said yes. So I thought, what do you do? So I said, well, really, he was looking like if he could get a dress, he would like to write to her. The guy said yes. So I think, so I said, would you give me her address? He said yes. Well, he said she's married one of the top cancer surgeons in Sydney, and she lives over in Sydney. But he said, I'll give you her address. If you think of the logics of this, amazing. So anyway, so I write the address down, and I post it off to Rodney in England, and I say, Rodney, you have to believe in a miracle. I've managed to get the address of Beverly for you. And I think you should just thank God for that, you know, just something a little bit like that. Well, I never heard back from Rodney for a couple of 3 weeks. And he wrote me this raving letter. I'm sorry I lost it, but it was a raving letter. Dear Paul, I have written to Beverly, and she has written back.
Yeah.
And so excited about this, Beverly wrote back to me after 25 years. And he said, as a result of this, my faith in God has been restored and renewed. And I'm now out of the mental hospital, In fact, I'm back there as a counsellor. Now, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in the impossibility becoming possible in God? I mean, this is an inspiration story to me, but it showed me something about myself, which I'm not being proud of this, but I slightly did persevere with it, you know?
Yeah.
I could have just said it was a load of rubbish. Sometimes the doorway is a little bit of perseverance, right? You know, the doorway to the...
So was he kind of obsessed about finding her, sitting down wanting to write a letter, but not knowing? So he was in a bad way when you first, was he sort of obsessed about?
I think it was a set-up by God
Yeah.
that I arrived there
Yeah,
as he
and
was
to
there,
help.
Yeah.
and that even that her sister had escaped from an asylum in London and gone up to nearly Liverpool, where this mum lived. I mean, she was just so bad news that she had to get the police within a few days and take. And she was put in this one. She was never sent back to London.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God is amazing
Yeah.
in setting things up for us.
Yes.
Have you ever felt they've been set up by God for good stuff?
And it's in his time,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
So, anyway, next year, or that year, I went back to England. And I feel like crying. But, so I went to visit Rodney in his house, which was just down the road.
Wow.
And he was just a remarkable guy.
Yeah.
Vibrantly alive, talking about, laughing about what had happened with his old girlfriend, you know.
Yeah.
And I wrote to Rodney for quite a few years, and then it seemed to disappear. And about 5 years ago, which is about 30 years later, at least, I decided to go and find Rodney.
Yeah.
So I lost his address because my sister-in-law was only about 5 or 10 miles away from where that town was. I said to Sid, I'm going to go down and find Rodney. Now, I haven't got his address, and it's a huge town, probably 20, 30,000 people. So I drive down there, so this is a whole lot of what they call faith madness.
Yes.
I drove down and think, now what would you do? So I went to a supermarket, which was in this, and it was quite a low economic area. I went to a supermarket and I thought, oh, well, you know, if he's shopping on that, went in there, they're all, I think from Poland or something like that, didn't speak the language much. And they just shook their heads, no. So then I decided to go to a pub. There was only one pub in this place, I don't know why, but there was only one pub that I knew about. So I go to this pub. Now it was a game, it was a top football match on somewhere, and a few people around, and I go up to the barman and say, you know, do you know Rodney W. Smith was his name, do you know Rodney? And no, they don't know Rodney. So I'm thinking, well, although the game was up, there was just about 3 guys sitting watching the TV of this game. I don't know what it's about. I mean, the pub guy must have been in it as well, because he said, I'd just go and ask those guys. So I went down there, and I mean, you have to be mad, don't you?
Yes.
I went down there and said to these guys, oh, I'm from New Zealand, I'm just looking for a friend of mine, Rodney Smith, who lived in this town. And the guy looked at me and said, oh, he died 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But you know what?
Yeah.
Although it was kind of sad he had died, it finalised me. I don't have to keep looking for him. Amazing, isn't it? And these guys said this, we never come to this pub except today, we just come here. We've never ever been to this pub before. This is not our pub.
Amazing.
Can you believe that God is bigger and arranging things than you think?
Yeah.